General Sir Mike, I don't have to introduce you really. Everybody here knows who you are. You ended up as head of the British Army after a very distinguished and long military career. Let's take you back to the beginning of that and ask, what motivated you to pursue a military life? What was it about for you?
I always get asked this, and I never quite know how to answer it. When I was 15 or 16, I was pretty clear that's what I wanted to do. But if you ask me, is the thought process which took me to that position, I don't know now. But I was clear by the time I was 16, that's what I wanted to do.
We were chatting briefly yesterday, and you said you wanted to talk a bit about the relationship between elected civilian leaders in a democracy and the military leadership. We'll get onto that, but let's just run through some of the key moments of your career. You served in Northern Ireland, and you were in the parachute regiment on Bloody Sunday in Londonderry.
Yes.
What are your thoughts about that now, especially in the light of David Cameron's apology after the inquiry?
Indeed, which I echoed the following day on the Today programme, as I recall. It was a tragedy. It was a tragedy all round. Obviously, for those who were killed, for their families, but it also was a tragedy for the army. And I think it is something an experience which I've drawn on quite a lot in subsequent operations as to this very careful judgment required as to the degree of force which is appropriate, lawful, all of that. But we forget just what a very turbulent place Northern Ireland was in those early days. Londonderry was pretty close to anarchy. So I regard it, looking back, as I say, as a tragedy, but one from which I think better things eventually came. Thank heavens.
And do you think because many people take the view now that Northern Ireland's descent into decades of what we euphemistically called the Troubles was not then yet inevitable, that event was a recruiting sergeant for the IRA, that young men from Republican backgrounds.
And there will be an element, I'm sure, of truth in that. But Northern Ireland had been in a state of close to anarchy for some 18 months before that. There was the very controversial decision to introduce internment in the autumn before. And that winter was pretty awful. The casualties on both sides, but particularly on the security forces, went exponential before the 30th of January 1971.
What do you think it says about the way successive British governments of both parties handled Northern Ireland during those terrible years, that it took 40-something years to get to the apology moment?
Yes. The armed forces were operational in Northern Ireland for 30 years less 2 weeks. And there's a lesson there. There are many lessons, but my lesson is now on duration. Conflict at the end of the day is a political phenomenon. Conflict between groups of people. Here we had two groups of people on one small piece of territory who had quite different ideas of who they were, where they'd come from, and how their future was to lie. That's a political problem. It can only in the end have a political solution. But the job of the security forces was to keep the space open for that political solution to emerge. And I believe that's what we did do. But it took a very long time for that political settlement to be arrived at.
Why? Why did it take so long? It's said that, for example, the Sinn Féin IRA leadership, or many of them, wanted to stop years and years before they did stop. And the reason they kept it going was that they didn't know how to stop.
Yes,
They didn't know how to tell their people.
Yes, and how dangerous it would be for them to do so. Dangerous to them personally, because some of their followers would regard them as traitors by seeking a political settlement. But it was quite clear the IRA were not ever going to defeat the British state. They could hurt it, but they were never going to defeat it. Equally well, there is no military solution to that political conflict, political reasons behind it.
And what happened, as you understand it, inside Sinn Féin IRA for them to reach that moment where they were ready to do a deal?
You better ask them. But I think it was the growing realization that the British state was not going to concede to violence, nor should it ever have done so.
I want to talk to you as well about Kosovo, which you played a very important role in. I once brought a television camera to you to ask you about the moment when you and Wesley Clark are reported to have fallen out, when he ordered you to go and seize the airport in Pristina before the Russians got there. Talk me through what, and you said when I interviewed you for television, you said you'll have to wait till my book comes out.
Well, indeed, it has now come out, ladies and gentlemen. There are a number of copies, and I'd be delighted to sign them afterwards. And it's all in chapters 11 and 12.
Do you want to give us the oral account?
Briefly, I think. It's 1999, and you'll remember the sequence of events. In the light of Bosnia, in the shadow of Srebrenica, in the shadow of Rwanda, when the West was accused of standing by whilst dreadful things were done. An action was therefore taken to secure the lives of the mainly Muslim population of Kosovo. I mean, incidentally, it's just worth reflecting that those first three interventions, and we might talk about intervention as a stratagem, Bosnia, Kosovo, and hardly known about Macedonia, the West taking military and other risks on behalf of beleaguered Muslim populations, which is often forgotten in the heat of the debate over more recent interventions. So here we are. Milosevic is threatening to do dreadful things to the Muslim population of Kosovo, and the West takes action by using military force against the Serbs as a method of coercing Milosevic to concede. What were the political objectives of that operation? In the short term, it became soundbite. Serbs out, NATO in, refugees back. A bit simplistic, you might say, but there were good straplines. The longer-term political objectives were left hanging, i.e., should Kosovo be independent or should it not? What was to be its future relationship with Serbia? Not spelled out at that time. The bombing goes on, I think, for 76 days, if my memory serves me correctly. And we were we had started sometime before early June, which is when we come to it, thinking, if this bombing doesn't work, what next? Because
it looked as though it wasn't working for a long time.
It looked as though it wasn't working. And the answer to that question, I think, was fairly simple. Either we accept that we have failed to coerce Milosevic, pack up, go home, and the political effects of that would have been really quite astounding. I don't think NATO would have survived. Or we have to pursue this, even at the expense of having to fight the Serbs on the ground. But Milosevic does concede in early June. And there is then a series of talks with the Serb military, which involved me and my staff, in order to work out how to do this. We were about 15,000. It wasn't a fighting force. It was designed for peace implementation. Now, in the background is Russia. We're not long out of the Cold War, and I have a personal view that the West was less than generous to Russia as the Cold War concluded and the old Soviet Union collapsed. I'm not sure that Churchill's advice that in victory magnanimity was really heeded. And so you had Russia feeling left out. There was no Security Council resolution. Russia would have vetoed it without a doubt, given the Slav connections, the Orthodox Church connections. And so we had a rather pissed off Russia. And what they did was a military thing, but it was really political, by saying you cannot go around, you the West cannot go around ignoring Russia. We are a permanent member of the Security Council, we are a major actor on the world stage, and you cannot ignore us. So their throw of this particular dice was to move a relatively small but significant military force from their contingent in Bosnia, where they'd been almost from the beginning and played an important part. But they moved them from Bosnia to Kosovo without any form of warning or... Now, we'd always expected there to be a Russian contingent in KFOR, Kosovo Force. It was just the manner of their arrival was somewhat unscripted.
And they went straight for the airport, didn't they?
They wanted to go to the airport because it had a significance. Anyway, at this point, we got notice that the Russians were on the move on the morning of Friday, the 11th of June. And we had arranged with the Serbs, they would start their withdrawal the following morning. We would start to move in to Kosovo the following morning, first light on Saturday the 12th of June. And the Russians move on the day before. And I was given a warning order by General Clark to go to the airport at Pristina, the capital of Kosovo, and stop the Russians going to the airport. And I said, well, what if they don't want to be stopped? What is it I am to do? Wasn't clear. Because the mandate I had nothing to do with, if need be, fighting Russians for the possession of a poxy little airport in the Balkans, which we didn't need anyway, because we had Skopje in Macedonia International Airport. So we had, I'm afraid, a professional difference on that.
But he was your commanding officer, wasn't he?
He was indeed.
So you were insubordinate?
I was.
Is that regular?
Well...
but is it true that you said to him, I'm not starting World War III for you?
Well, it's rumoured I did, you know. I really can't remember. More seriously, it was a moment which no senior officer would volunteer for, because, quite rightly, as soldiers, you are brought out with virtually your mother's milk, that you follow the direction of your superior officer, because without that, you get chaos. But equally well, as you get more senior, and inevitably you are working within that political environment. Clausewitz again, use of force politics by another means. You've got a strategic judgment you've got to make as well, and these two came into conflict. And I was quite clear that what I was being asked to do, to me, and more importantly, not just to me, because once we got this direction, I said time was very, very short. And I said to my immediate planning staff, look, go away for an hour, work it through. I will do it on my own. We'll come back and compare. And we did just that. And we, all concerned, said, it's not a good idea. And so I had to stick my neck out. Unfortunately, it didn't get chopped off. But I thought I'd be out of a job within 48 hours.
And why do you think that didn't happen?
Because both London and Washington, taking the political strategic view, and for which I'm eternally grateful to both administrations at the time, saw it my way.
And General Clark was an interesting character, though, wasn't he? I mean, we used to interview him a lot. He was very amenable to us.
Yes.
And he was quite a political fellow.
He was a very political man, very media savvy, very intelligent man, Rhodes Scholar, all of that. But he gave us the impression, and when I say us, my headquarters, which included an American brigadier who ran my operations branch, he gave a very clear impression that he was still in the Cold War. He described the Russian move as this is the race for Berlin in 1945 all over again.
Did he really?
He did say that, yes. We went,
yeah.
Perhaps we're not quite at that scale yet. So there we are.
He used to talk about, to us, about rolling forward the frontiers of Jeffersonian democracy into the Balkan Peninsula.
Yeah.
I asked you this yesterday, though, for those of you who were here yesterday, I apologise, but is that what you thought you were doing? Were you rolling forward Jeffersonian democracy?
It hadn't crossed my mind until he put it that way.
Let's talk a bit about intervention.
Yeah.
The Western democracies didn't intervene in an effective way in Bosnia. One of the lessons of that was diplomatic efforts alone, unless they're predicated on a willingness to use force, ultimately, will be ineffective. A threat to use force has to be backed up by the readiness to actually use force. And that's what happened in Kosovo. There was also the intervention which everybody forgets, which was Sierra Leone, which was a tremendous British success story. Britain acting alone, in effect, one battalion of parachute regiment saved Freetown and stopped the war. There was Kosovo. Do you think that Bosnia, successful intervention in the end, Sierra Leone, Kosovo and
Macedonia.
Macedonia is a great unsung one as well. Great NATO success story there. Prevented a war happening rather than intervening to stop it once it starts. Do you think that whetted the appetite of Tony Blair in particular for intervention, for war as a policy option?
Yes, I think that is an inescapable conclusion. If you read Blair's memoirs, he was very frustrated by, as he saw it, the inability of the government machine of Britain to implement what he wanted, except, in his view, the armed forces. When he said, I want you to go there and do this, we went there and did it. And I think, and that's very true of Kosovo. And we must remember that Blair made a very seminal speech at the Chicago, so-called Chicago speech of April, I think it was, 1999, when he laid out his philosophy on what he called humanitarian intervention. Then we were able to deliver what he was after in Kosovo. Sierra Leone was an amazing success. I don't know how much is known about that operation in Sierra Leone generally. Who's seen the film Blood Diamond? Yeah, okay. What was portrayed there, I'm told by those who really know what was going on in Sierra Leone at the time, is at the very bottom end of the scale. of the brutality which was actually occurring. And again, there's a parallel to Bosnia. There were in Sierra Leone at that time, where are we, May 2000, 17,000 UN soldiers who could not or would not stop the bestiality of arms and legs being chopped off and all of that. But 1,000 British soldiers did.
800.
It was 800.
Yeah.
I stand corrected.
I was there. I reported that myself, and it was within 48 hours of being there. And they were sent for 5 or 6 days to evacuate British nationals. And they turned the presence turned it around. And you know, I interviewed Tony Blair about this 10 years on, and I said, you know, you're still a national hero in Sierra Leone. He said, oh, it's nice to know I'm still popular somewhere in the world. But and David Richards, who was the brigadier who ran that show, says he gets invited to stand for president in Sierra Leone. And it did. But so do you think that Tony Blair carried that into his into Iraq, basically?
You better ask him. I don't know.
You won't talk about Iraq.
I don't know what his thought process was, but I think it is fair to conclude that those four, Bosnia, Kosovo, Macedonia and Sierra Leone, gave the then Prime Minister a sense that the use of force can short-circuit other political avenues to achieve the results he was seeking.
And what do you think of the way that played itself out in Iraq then? Do you think it was a...
Yeah, Iraq is somewhat different to those first four interventions. We touched on this yesterday afternoon, and for those of you who are here, I wouldn't want to bore you by repeating, but I am of the view, as many of the military are, that Iraq didn't start in 2002-3. It started way back in 90, where are we?
1990.
1990, thank you, with Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait. And that historical time thread goes right through. In my view, had he not invaded Kuwait, it probably wouldn't have been a Western invasion of Iraq 12, 13 years later. So it is different. It is different.
Was it a misjudgment?
As Chou En-lai said to Richard Nixon when asked about the significance in history of the French Revolution, it's far too early to tell. And there's an element of that. And making that judgment is, of course, made more difficult and more complex by events elsewhere in the Middle East since 2003, because the region is now in upheaval, as we sadly see every day. And so I'm not going to call it yet.
You talked about clarity.
Iraq, I mean, here it is, with its two great rivers, vast mineral resources, a well-educated population. It has such potential if they can solve their sectarian differences by peaceful political means and not by violence.
There was a story that the invasion was called Operation Iraqi Freedom. There was a story that did the rounds at the time, and I've never been able to tell whether it was true, that its original working title was Operation Iraqi Liberation, until somebody realised what the acronym would mean. OIL.
I mean, that's the one thing it wasn't about. Nobody was mentioning. No, not at all. And there was no oil in the other four places we've discussed, so it's a chimera.
You talk about the importance of clarity when General Clark said, go to the airport and stop the Russians, and it wasn't clear what you should do if the Russians didn't want to be stopped. In the relationship between the military leadership of a democracy and the elected government of that democracy, and we're talking about Britain, is there tension sometimes because the military don't believe the consequences of an operation have been thought through?
Yes, I mean, it is very difficult to forecast outcomes. It's easier to say, well, we can do this in the immediate time frame, and we need so much of this and that to do it with. But the longer term consequences are quite difficult to foresee, and there could be a range anyway. And where do you sit? In a democracy, that civil-military interface will from time to time have tension. And there's nothing wrong with that, absolutely nothing wrong with that. Because it's only by hard debate you actually will push out the options. But when it comes to the point that the duly elected government says we are now going to do this, you have two choices. One, you follow your constitutional duty and carry it out, even if it may not be what you personally would wish to see or do. Or you will have to say, sorry, you will have to find somebody else to do this. There's no middle course there. And it has to be like that.
Does it become trickier when it's a coalition of the willing? Because Kosovo included the French. The French were involved in that campaign.
Les Français, voilà.
General Short, who was the Air Force commander running the aerial campaign, the American Air Force commander, he got very, very frustrated indeed with the political leaders because he wanted to go and bomb Belgrade much sooner than he was allowed to. And
that might have forced Milosevic earlier than...
And he very much blamed the French, and the French then put a two-star general in his command to keep an eye on him. Those tensions are quite debilitating, aren't they?
It is the exception rather than the rule, certainly for a country such as Britain, to operate independently. In fact, in my service, only twice, the Falklands and Sierra Leone were both national operations on our own. Every other operation we've carried out have been in some sort of coalition, either the formal alliance of NATO or the coalition so-called of the willing. And it does complicate things. It gives much greater political strength. I mean, the US did not need any allies to do Iraq, for example, in military terms, but they needed them in political terms. But it complicates things. My analogy is always here the concert orchestra. You know, to play a particular piece of music, you need so much strings, woodwind, brass, etc., and you've got to assemble all of that. And it really helps if every musician has exactly the same version of the piece they're going to play, but quite often the versions are somewhat different. And it doesn't half help to have a single conductor rather than about a dozen. But that's the nature of an international force.
People close to Donald Rumsfeld in the year or two running up to the Iraq War used to talk about the changes that Rumsfeld wanted to make in the American armed forces. And bear in mind that the Americans spend more on their military than the next 16 or 17 nations combined. And neocon thinking at that time was that pretty soon America militarily wouldn't want any allies at all because allies would simply get in the way.
Oh, yeah, it's friction.
And they said the only ally that they could imagine, there would come a point when the only ally who would be genuinely militarily helpful on the battlefield would be Israel. That was neocon thinking at the time. Was that fantasy?
Yeah, it sounds like politics rather than anything else to me.
Let me ask you one more question before I throw it open to the audience. Trident. Do we need Trident?
Well, we've got Trident. I think, do we need a follow-on?
Yeah,
Do we need Son of Trident?
Yeah.
Right. We live in an increasingly uncertain world. Nuclear proliferation is happening. That genie, it seems to me, cannot be put back into the bottle. For myself, I am absolutely of the view that Britain would be foolhardy not to maintain that last-ditch national life insurance policy. And people say, well, we've never used it. Precisely, it's there not to be used because we've deterred anybody else from using. It's often said that the worry is not now states but non-state actors and how they deterred. But it's not there to deter a terrorist attack. It is there to deter, at some point if need be, a state which threatens this country with nuclear weapons. And the fact we can't see one right now doesn't mean to say, in my view, that in 50 years' time, or over a span of 50 years, because that's the time frame we're looking at, such a situation might not arise. It's often said it's far too expensive. Well, let's just dissect that for one moment. The running costs are about £2 billion a year, which in one sense is a vast amount of money. But to put that in the context of government spending this financial year of about £750 billion, 2 out of 750. I don't regard that as being expensive. It's 0.0 whatever it is percent of GDP. And my final rather banal analogy is we all insure our houses. Well, I think we should ensure well-being and security.
So that's a yes. Let me ask you in the audience for your questions now. There's one hand up at the back and another one slightly further forward.
Excuse the slight naivety of this question, but in light of that desire for an Iraq that moves forward through peaceful means and solves sectarian issues in a means beyond violence, if the next generation coming through have been absolutely brutalized by being surrounded by violence, put onto them from all sides, from the West, from their own people, from different religious persuasions and different tribal persuasions, what hope can there be if there is nobody who takes a stand to a non-violent position in advance of that? So you're asking people to reach a position where it feels that it's very hard to see people make that leap when they've just been surrounded by total violence.
I think that takes us into the even more complex question of the Middle East as a whole, the Arab world, the world of Islam, which sadly, tragically seems to be going through a most terrible time where violence is the means now which is preeminent in the power struggles that are going on. I can't answer your question. I simply cannot. Other than if Iraq had so much in its grasp, and if it cannot, and it's not just Iraq, I mean Syria, it's becoming basically sectarian. And the fate of the Christian minority now, they are being brutalized themselves purely because they happen to be different. So I can't answer that question, I'm sorry.
We had a hand up.
Yes. Thanks. I just wanted to, first of all, recognize firsthand as a civilian aid worker in many of these countries in the Balkans you've just been mentioning, during the 90s, the impressive capacity of the British Army at that time to manage in very unstable and difficult circumstances the operations they were doing in comparison to the French, the Danish, Spanish and others that were there, and it was excellent and it helped us do our work, which was the mission then. It was to facilitate humanitarian aid, and the job done in Sierra Leone was excellent. It would have been great 2 years later if they could have done the same in Liberia, but unfortunately it was somebody else's call. My question to you now is, should there be independence, what would the English army look like?
Oh,
as that's what
it would still be the British Army. because it would still include the Welsh and Northern Irish,
Fair point.
for which the generic title would have to be still British. We're on delicate ground here, I mean, because we are in Scotland. I'm not a politician, I'm a retired soldier. But if you want my view, I'm a dyed-in-the-wool, through and through unionist. I believe the union has allowed both countries to put two and two together and make rather more than four. To be specific in your question, if there were to be a vote for independence, Mr. Salmon's got an awful lot of work to do on defence, because he really has made no sense to me so far. We all await this white paper, don't we, which will be the answer to everything, no doubt. I predict under those circumstances, most Scotsmen and that proportion of young women who go to the military will opt to join the British Army rather than some Scottish army, because there'll be nothing to do.
There's precedent for this, isn't there? Aren't there citizens of the Irish Republic serving in the British Armed Forces?
Indeed there are. Under the arrangements made when the Republic got its full independence, when it stopped being a free state, there were a number of issues which really, I mean, citizens of the Republic have the right to vote in general elections of the United Kingdom. We think, why on earth? Because it goes back, of course, to... And citizens of the Republic may join the British Armed Forces without let or hindrance.
And it is possible, isn't it, that if Scotland were to vote for independence next year, is there any reason why an agreement can't be reached between the two successor states for the British Army still to have bases in Scotland, to have
Indeed.
training grounds?
Well, I mean, the big one is Faslane. That's the big one, going back to the deterrent. There would have to be some sort of arrangement for sovereign bases. It goes to the absolute heart of it. I don't think there's any more to be said on that one.
So you think that an independent Scotland might be persuaded to keep Trident where it is?
They won't want to do that. The cost of replicating Faslane and, more important, Coulport, which is where the warheads are stored and maintained. Faslane is a very smart dockyard, and that can be replicated, but Coulport would be quite very expensive. It can be done, of course.
How long would it take to do it?
I'd be guessing 5 to 10 years. I'm not a nuclear expert.
He wants you want to come back on it briefly, go on.
Sorry, I can't hear.
Here's the microphone.
Yes, just to say, as a Scotsman and a British person working abroad in difficult countries, I am aware now that if there were independence, the Scottish engagement would be greatly minimised. Should it be a British army, as you call it, Scotland wouldn't consider it. Most Scottish people wouldn't consider it a Scots within a British army. It would be, partial. And I would see as Scots people's engagement in these international conflicts, which prior to Iraq was something we could be kind of proud of, I think, those former conflicts I mentioned. I think we would miss out, we would lose our role in engaging internationally, militarily and otherwise.
Okay, thank you very much. There's other people who wants to get in. Yes, yeah, okay, yes.
Just a question about Somalia.
Yeah.
Of course, in Somalia, the Americans withdrew very, very quickly, and we all know the unhappy history of Somalia since 1993.
That, yeah.
Sorry?
You're talking of the Mogadishu disaster.
Yes,
yeah.
the debacle where the Americans withdrew very quickly. More recently, of course, there's been a combination of military action, I think by the Ethiopians, the African Union has been involved, financed by Western governments and so on. I just wonder what was discussed at the time in British circles about intervening.
In Somalia?
Yes. I mean, obviously it's a low-level interest and perhaps was dismissed at the time, but there have been very heavy costs in terms of piracy.
Can I expand the question really rather than just Somalia? For 20 years now, I mean, here's the roll call. Sierra Leone, Kosovo, Macedonia, Bosnia, East Timor, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and a small bit of help to the French in Mali. I may have forgotten one, but I think that's it. That's 9 in the 2 decades or so and a bit since the end of the Cold War. It's a stratagem which we've already reflected. The first 4 of those certainly were, I think, pretty successful in achieving. Then it gets murkier. I detect in the United States and in the United Kingdom a very rapidly shrinking appetite for further intervention right now, and that must include Somalia, Syria, and I don't think the political will is there. Whether it should be is another matter.
Since we're talking about Somalia, the concept of the Mogadishu line, crossing the Mogadishu line, was very much part of the mindset of policymakers at the time, and it constrained them, I think, in Bosnia for a long time, because successive generals used to come, especially British and Americans, used to come through Bosnia and talk about the dangers of crossing the Mogadishu line, moving from a peacekeeping, even though there was no peace to keep, to war fighting. And I think
and Beirut comes into that in the American experience,
and Vietnam
as well, and going further back. No, but I mean, the West's involvement in Bosnia. I mean, there is so much there that initial attempt to ameliorate the worst effects of a pretty vicious war by helping humanitarian aid get through, but not taking any steps to stop the war.
Well, we learned, didn't we, that humanitarian response can have the effect of prolonging a conflict without changing its outcome.
And it took a massacre. It took Srebrenica.
But Srebrenica was different only in scale to what had been happening there for 3 years. There had been mini Srebrenicas right from the very beginning.
Course. But that was so dramatic and so public that it did change the game without any doubt. It allowed NATO to win the argument about the use of small but very precise amounts of force, which got to Dayton and the peace agreement.
Yes, go on. And then there's one back there.
A quick balance to my
court-martial myself on Monday morning.
No. It's a quick balance to my overly aggressive question from yesterday, because your immense experience and your abilities and the contribution I believe you still have to make to Britain is taken as read. You say that you're a retired soldier and not a politician. In the hopeful event that you are elevated to the House of Lords, what would you most like to use a political position to change about the armed forces in the UK? And secondly, what would you most like to bring from the armed forces, as great politicians like Lord Ashdown have done in the past, of those distinctive British military qualities that can enrich our political life in the UK?
Well, I wasn't expecting that from you, I must say.
Golly, that's very interesting. And I spent 45 years in the military, and it is a different place. Sorry, that's a banal thing to say, but one has to start there. We push very hard for clarity all the time to try and reduce Rumsfeld, the unknown unknowns, sorry about that, but it was the one useful thing he did say, I think. That striving for clarity and then to be as clear thinking as possible, and then take the team with you and whatever you do. That's what I think is my abiding sense of that previous life of mine, which is different, actually. And there's another aspect, too, which is integrity. If you, as an army officer, use your private car to go from A to B and it's 50 miles, but you put in the claim for 100, you will get court-martialed and sacked, and quite rightly. We are absolutely black and white about it.
Do you fancy it, a peerage?
Not hugely, no. There's all those bloody politicians, you see.
Yes, at the back.
I just wanted to go back to Srebrenica because I think it is a very important.
Where are you,
sorry,
sir?
over here.
Yes, thank you.
Very important key to what then became, I think, intervention for the following that. When everyone was sitting around and Srebrenica was happening, and people were negotiating with Milosevic, and the UN at Kashi was talking to people, and there were people tearing their hair out, I believe, in the military, was the feeling that, well, we've been here for some time, and these are the rules, and surely Mladic isn't going to go bananas like they did in 92, 93 in Eastern Bosnia. Surely it's a question we can sort of, if we get through this one, and they manage to get all these people out of Srebrenica and park them somewhere near Tuzla, that's what's going to happen. Surely they're not going to kill all these guys. Was there a feeling that the war had moved to that stage, and they were caught by surprise by what actually happened when Mladic said, no, we want to kill every last one of them?
That's a hell of a question. I have never spoken to, and I hear he's a completely broken man, the Dutch commanding officer at Srebrenica on that day. I don't know what went through his mind. The rules of engagement, I suspect, were followed, and more than what was done by that Dutch battalion could not have been done under the rules. I'm often asked, what would a British battalion have done? What would a British commanding officer have done? We'll never know because it didn't happen, but my instinct tells me that a British commanding officer would have looked, learnt, spoken to Mladic, saw the buses, and then said to Mladic, you can fuck off, or else. I hope that's what would have happened. We'll never know.
That up.
Very quickly.
Would he have been backed by Jean-Pierre Nakashi and NATO? I mean, the feeling I got from reading about this and talking to people is that there wasn't the will to do something anyway, and the Dutchman was in a total
I'm sorry.
position.
Do you mind if I add something to that?
Yes, please.
When the Safe Areas Resolution was passed in 1993, so more than 2 years before the massacre at Srebrenica, Srebrenica was one of the safe areas.
Yeah.
I
Gradually.
wrote a piece for the BBC in which I said, when Srebrenica falls next month or next year, and hundreds of men are taken into a field and shot and buried in mass graves, let none of us say we didn't know it would happen. And it was the piece was never broadcast because it was considered by my editors partisan and incendiary. And but we all knew how poisonous it was in that valley, and we all knew that military catastrophe at Srebrenica would end in mass murder. So I don't know why it was allowed to happen. It's remained one of the great mysteries.
I know we've had the finish sign. Can I have 1 minute? Because I'm going to a little anecdote which I think pulls together much of this soft power, hard power, although we haven't put it in quite those terms. But it's what this debate has been all about. What is the right mixture? It's Sierra Leone. It's 2000. And we've already spoken of it. But my elder son followed me into the army for 8 or 9 years, and he was a young officer on that intervention. And he's given a particular task, having got into the airport, which was to go to the residence of the British High Commissioner to ensure that he was okay and to prepare the garden of the residence for the evacuation of non-combatants, both British and other nationalities. Now, how he gets there is another story, because at that point, the so-called Revolutionary United Front, a grand name for a bunch of obscene thugs, were at the gates of Freetown. Anyway, he gets there. As he said, Dad, it was dark, quite a lot of shot and shell going on, but we made it, all with the help of a photocopied street plan of Freetown taken from the Lonely Planet Guide. It's called Initiative. And they get to the residence, and some of you will be familiar with the style of those lovely old colonial buildings, the high wall with the broken glass and the concrete at the top, 2 big doors. And he said, Dad, first problem was how to get in. And so I rang the bell, he said. Nothing happened. The soldier 2 down, he had about 20 soldiers with him, was his demolitions man, who had in his rucksack everything he needed, and was dying to blow the doors down. Come on, sir, I can crack it. 40 seconds. And young Jackson, thinking that this probably wasn't a career-enhancing move to blow up Crown property, which is what it is, said, hang on, lad. He said, at that point, Dad, I leant against the door and lo and behold, it opened. Down the crunchy gravel drive, there's a lovely white house with the colonnades and the balcony and the veranda and all that. He said, Dad, same problem, front door. Leant on it, nothing happened. Young soldier with the kit in his rucksack said, this one, sir, 20 seconds, come on, let me at it. He said, no, hang on, lad. And he said, well, rang the bell. And the door opened after a moment or two, and there's a very large, imposing black gentleman in starched whites looking up and down this rather scruffy and probably rather smelly guy in British Army uniform said yes, and Mark Jackson said, High Commissioner in? One moment. Vanishes down the corridor, and then round the corner comes the imposing Somerset Maugham-like figure of the great man. And Mark, thinking this is a moment of very considerable historical significance. Well, it was for him, anyway. Salutes, High Commissioner, Sir, Captain Mark Jackson, British Army, just make sure. Followed by the immortal response, my dear boy, I knew you'd make it. Would you like a drink? So there you have. To soften the hard power as one.